Okay, so I think I'm going first this afternoon because I'm trying to set the stage for a little bit more of the detailed discussion. And I'll go into a few details on lead ND, but not a ton. It's a very, very complex sort of topic. It's also not without controversy. So we'll start with transportation and land use. I think this is sort of a basic discussion that I'm sure many of us are well versed in, but it's going to set the stage for the more details I'm going to give about lead and then lead ND. Does anybody know where this is? Any guesses? Any part of the country you might think? It's Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Close, I guess. But anyways, what do we notice about this image? Is it a nice place to be? Is it, look like you want to be there? Do you want to be sitting down, having some coffee, talking with your neighbors there?
We have this there.
Right, exactly. Well, anyways, Portsmouth is a very small town. It's about 20,000 people. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. And one of the great things about it was built largely before places like Charlotte were built. And I don't mean that to be mean, but just the pattern of development is a lot different. The approach to building was a lot different. And what we're struggling with now so strongly is how do we get back to an environment where we have something like that out of our front door, or we have access to that in multiple ways. So again, I'm going to try and keep you guys engaged a little bit here after lunch. I want everyone to raise their hand to the following series of questions. So when you walk out of your front door, wherever it is that you live, I want to know, can you walk comfortably to more than just one destination? Let's see a raise of hands. Okay, about 2/3 of the room. How many feel like they can bike, not just can bike, but want to bike to numerous places and regional destinations and they feel safe and secure doing it? Great, okay. A bunch of self-selectors here. How about the bus? Is the bus reliable? Do you take it? Is it comfortable? Does it get you where you need to go? Okay, numbers falling off a little. Okay, about half of the room. And then rail. Far few of you. And that can be any rail. Streetcar, regional rail, commuter rail. No. And then who can drive? Pretty much everybody. Okay. So we know that livability is all about having real choices between all of these modes and more. That kind of leads to this discussion of, it's interesting when you talk to a room of people in our field, it tends to be people who choose to live in places where they have those options. But it seems like a lot of people in America don't always have those options or choose to live in places where those options aren't present. So if you look at an image here of downtown Charlotte, you see an image of a lot of things put together in a really small space. The walkability ranking, which is, from WalkScore, which is really a measure of quantitative things that are close by in proximity. It's not really a measure of quality, just quantity. Shows you that's a pretty walkable place. And this measure is taken from the address of where we are right now. If you move just a few miles, I think north and east of here, you get a very, very different story. And unfortunately, those mode choices should have dropped by more than half. The translation from Keynote to PowerPoint doesn't always bring those things over, but you see the WalkScore of Perimeter Parkway, where there's a nice Trek bicycle store, is 60. And what do we notice about the patterns of land use here between the two? Grid. What about the size of the streets? I mean, you can sort of make out the streets in the blocks here, but look at the streets in this image. Very, very different. And so we know that has a primary effect on the choices you have when you leave your front door, has a huge effect on walking as sort of very roughly measured by WalkScore. It has a huge, look at the land use here and look at the transportation costs and the CO2 emissions. This is a really cool tool called ABOGO. Who's familiar with ABOGO? Just one person? Okay. This is through the Center for Neighborhood Technology, which is a wonderful nonprofit in Chicago who aggregated data from across the country on transportation costs, average, transportation costs by, I think, census tract, and the amount of pollution, as in CO2, that you will probably emit if you live in certain locations. And so green is obviously better than red. And so I just compared and contrasted the two environments I showed you here and here through ABOGO's eyes, and what you get is you save more than $200 a month if you're going to live near or in downtown Charlotte, and you're emitting far less CO2. And so the whole idea here is that our land use and our transportation are very much linked, but they have a really big impact on, obviously, the environment and how we get around and the choices that we have. So where does a street network come into that? Well, the street network is how we connect all of our land uses, all of our places, all of our destinations. This is a very, very common scene, much like that second place in Chicago, outside of Charlotte that we just showed with a BOGO. But network really helps to define our places in terms of our sense of it. If I removed all the names off of these grid patterns, you would probably be able to name at least a few of those, I'm sure, just by looking at it. New York has Broadway, it's very iconic. The two grids smashing together at Market Street in San Francisco. Rome is, I think that pattern is quite well known for people who study cities. So really you get all these different patterns that have come out over time and very organically in some ways, but they're all different, but they're all connected, right? They're all tight street networks, give you lots of different choices. There's actually a whole range of street types. One thing that you find, again, in that second image I showed in Charlotte, is that you really have three types of streets there. You've got the cul-de-sac and the local, you've got the collector where all the cul-de-sacs empty out onto, and then you've got the arterial and or the highway where all the traffic jams are. Well, thinking about these places, you have lots of different types of streets and lots of different options, and most of them actually connect. This was actually a small project that we did with the Project for Public Spaces with Gary, actually, in a small town in Maine called Brunswick. And we took their three sort of existing mandated, functional classification street types and looked at how we could really code this town with 10 different types, some being prioritized for automobility, but a lot of them actually more about balance or more tipping it towards the scale of the residential street and the living street for streets that are designed for people.
Can you say it's hard to read, what are the different types there?
Sure. These were just names that we actually came up with the community, so it's sort of they helped name. Some of them are, residential avenue, there's a drive, highway, commercial arterial, commercial avenue, community street, destination street, slow flow street, shared use path, and residential street. And those all had design meaning. What you don't see here is a table of characteristics that went with all of those. But it makes for a much more complex network of streets, not just the three simple types. And back to the bigger pattern, again, what you see here in this old town in Maine is that some of the streets are disconnected, but most of them actually connect to places and to other streets. This is an image that we took from another project in Colorado we worked on, which is the old part of the city, which was developed more in the first half of the 20th century. Everything was connected. Several different types of streets, some mixed-use commercial mixed in. You go kind of the post-1945 suburban network pattern, and then the most recent pattern. And this moves from south to north in the city, which is the way that the network developed and the city developed. And what's fascinating is you see how disconnected everything gets as you go further into current day. And what that essentially does is it puts all of the traffic and all the pressure onto just a few streets, which then get over-designed and become very, very difficult for people to walk and bike. So we're really battling this end state condition right now, and I think the desire and what we're discussing today is getting back to more of that grid-connected, complex, nuanced network. And we know that connectivity matters. Again, I probably am preaching to the choir a bit here, but just the sheer distance of being able to get places, the legibility of getting around, having streets orient in north-south direction, east-west. It's a little bit easier to move from home to school or to market and have choices in that pattern than obviously it is on the one on the left. But intersection density and networks really have an indication on safety. Speaking of Vision Zero, the less dense the network, on the left there, this is research from Norman Garrick, who's a wonderful transportation professor at UConn. He did all this research with all these cities. I think it was 115 different cities in California he looked at, and he found that the less connectivity in terms of intersection density there was, the more likely it was that you're going to get into a traffic crash. The denser the street network, the smaller the blocks, the more connections you have, it is a safer environment for everybody, driving, walking, biking, etc. And then the mode share, same study, looking at disconnected network, people walking in green, biking in orange, taking transit in blue, far, far, far less than in a connected, compact grid-like network. You see vast gains just in mode share, just by how we orient and connect our streets. And then obesity rates. This is a fun infographic. I think it came out, from Good, maybe a couple months ago. And I say it because I thought it was really interesting. You see you're looking at a top-down view of cyclists there, and the size, the amount of rotundness for each cyclist means there is the obesity rate in the country. And so you start with the USA on the left, and then you see in green is biking and orange is walking in terms of mode share at a national level. And as you move to the right, you know, no surprise, we go from sort of Australia, actually Australia and Canada are in the middle there, but they have much lower obesity rates. And similar walking and biking rates as the US. But as you get over to the right there, that's Northern Europe essentially. You know, Denmark and the Netherlands and Sweden and all those great places who have cold climates, but people are biking and walking all year long, and there's a massive, massive exponential amount of walking and biking happening there and far lower obesity rates. And then this is a very serious issue towards no deaths or towards zero deaths. We look at the numbers across the country, and we have 9/11 happening on our streets every single month. You know, and I think it's great to see people getting excited or being really outraged in this circle around these issues, but we have to take those issues and bring them out to the rest of our fellow citizens who aren't as well educated on the amount of deaths that are happening every single week, every single month. Very serious issue, and again, that connects back, in my opinion, back to our network design and how safe streets are, and the fact that we are throwing 40,000 cars at 40 miles an hour on one street is probably not that safe. So I give you all that background, and I apologize if it's rudimentary, but all of that to talk about LEED and LEED-ND. So I'm sure, has everyone heard of LEED, Leadership in Energy Design, right? How we rank green buildings. This is the number, I think this is the most recent count from LEED, or actually from the USGBC, which is the United States Green Building Council. You know, thousands of green buildings across the country, and this has proliferated at an unbelievable rate. And LEED was just launched as a pilot in 1998. A couple years later, it started to be more official, and then the whole programs have expanded, you know, dramatically. LEED for schools, LEED for retail, LEED for healthcare, LEED on down the line. But you know, in 2009, which I think is the latest one, they came up with a program called LEED for Neighborhood Development. This is a very, very different concept. LEED was about buildings, and LEED-ND is about place and context, and not just single buildings. And so here are some of these examples of what can be a LEED building in terms of building types. You've got a parking garage, a McDonald's, a single-family home, a factory, which I think is a GM factory, an office building, a stadium. You know, LEED can be applied to any kind of building type and is, which is a good thing. But what's wrong with LEED, or what's wrong with this picture in some ways? Does anyone have a guess? Location, right. That may be the most dreamy green kind of thing you could imagine, but where it is requires everybody to drive. So LEED's big shortcoming was it was very silent on transportation and land use. All those issues we just went over very quickly, and of course issues of networks and neighborhood design. So here's the one example I think everyone in our field likes to bash on is the green Walmart in a parking lot, right? How green is it actually? This quote from cement.org says that Walmart's experimental green store in McKinney, Texas features the latest in environmental sustainable design, including concrete parking lots and pervious paving. I'm not sure that's all that's going to get us to where we want to go. And fortunately, a lot of people realized that actually fairly early on after LEED started to really gain popularity. So the Congress for the New Urbanism, the USGBC, which is the forebearer of LEED, and then the NRDC, which is National Resources Defense Council, all came together and said, okay, how do we tackle this issue that we're building green buildings in the middle of parking lots where 99% of people have to drive? A very fundamental and big change to the LEED question, or to green building. So it really became this combination of smart growth, policy and design, new urbanism, thinking about neighborhood design, street design, network design, and also green buildings. And the idea is obviously to keep improving quality of life. So how LEED-ND works, there are 12 prerequisites. These are things that you have to actually do even before you can even think about earning the different credits and getting the different points. And so if you don't get all 12, you're out of luck. You're not going to get LEED-ND rated. You can earn 110 points if you were to max the system out. It's a system that's, again, only been in place for 2 years. It's still fairly experimental. It's young as a LEED rating system, so it's undergoing what they call a continuous improvement cycle. So every few years, they're going to revisit what is working, what is not, and hopefully advance the quality of the LEED-ND process and the projects that come out of it. But it's broken into these 5 different categories. Smart location and linkage, which has 27 points associated with it. Neighborhood pattern and design has the most points associated with it, 44. green infrastructure and buildings. I think that's more stormwater management and the actual design of the buildings within the neighborhood, 29 points. And then there's a couple small ones with innovation and design process, and also regional priority credit. So they actually broke out into different regions that certain things are going to be more appropriate in the Southwest than, say, the Northeast, which I think is quite smart. But some of the challenges and the pushback on LEED and LEED-ND in particular is that it's highly complex. It's a quantitative measure of the built environment of neighborhoods that have inherent complexity, and it says very, very little of civic art or beauty or design. So it's been criticized by many, saying, well, it's great to count all these things, but how does it actually look and feel on the ground? Which I think is a valid question. And it's also very expensive in some ways. Adding to your soft costs of $50,000 to $75,000 just to go after the rating system makes, especially in this market, very difficult. So I think LEED's dealing with that more and more these days. So I'm just actually going to go over two very quickly and just talk about 2 points within each. Again, this is not the kind of session where we want to go point by point. I encourage you to download the document if you're so interested. But with smart location and linkage, two key ones that I think are related to this group in this discussion this week are preferred locations and then bicycle network and storage. And so the preferred location discussion is really about where you decide to build. Again, this is all about prioritizing and giving higher or more points to places that are redeveloping where there's already existing infrastructure. Largely in downtowns, existing neighborhoods. It is possible to get some points for sites that are adjacent to existing development or existing neighborhoods, but it becomes more and more difficult. And they have a point scale. For these two, you can do an and an or. So you can get a range of 1 to 10 points. So the first set is where it's located, and the second set looks at the intersection density per square mile. So again, we're back to the network issue relating to location. And so if you can show that you have more than 400 intersections per square mile, you can max out those points. And if you can do both, if you're developing in downtown Charlotte, you can probably figure out a way to get 10 points, but elsewhere in the region, it'd be very, very difficult. That image on the right there is just the number of vacant or dead and dying malls from, I think, 2009, source in the Wall Street Journal. That shows you how many sites alone at that scale of around 100 acres around the country that could be redeveloped as neighborhoods in this way. So then moving to credit 4. This is one I'm sure a lot of people are more keyed into at this conference, but the bicycle network and storage requirement. Is anyone familiar with this in LEED-ND? Has anyone looked at this and analyzed it in any sort of way? One person? What did you find? Do you have any thoughts or opinions on it?
It was a while ago. I know I've looked at it.
Yeah, okay.
Previous album.
It's fairly simple in terms of its requirement. And I think in some ways it has to be a little bit more simplified for this larger, big picture discussion of LEED-ND and the ranking system. But you can see they have two requirements. One is the network requirement, and then the second part of it to earn that 1 point is the bicycle parking and storage. And I'm going to, at the end of this, go through a few of my critiques, but I was asked by the Congress for New Urbanism to give my thoughts on LEED-ND as it pertained to biking. And I did so, and I'm glad to see that in the most recent update, a few of the changes have been made, but largely I want you all in this room who are interested in this topic to think about it a little bit more and try and get involved to push the quality of the bike and bike storage and some of the other qualitative things in, quantitative rankings in LEED-ND. So bicycle storage, here's what you have to be able to demonstrate. One big fault that I saw with it was they don't really include mixed-use buildings. And another thing, actually, I'll get into it actually a little bit later in terms of my critique. But there's what you can see for what you have to accomplish in LEED-ND to get that point. So network and storage. Moving on. So then the second, and the biggest sort of sweet spot for LEED-ND is, again, the neighborhood pattern and design. It's really about walkability. That is the primary focus of LEED-ND, is really scaling things to the human pedestrian scale and rewarding that. So if you look really closely at two patterns here, this is actually two neighborhoods in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, both at the same scale. You can see on the left there, it has neighborhood structure in terms of a center and an edge. Things get denser at the middle and less dense on the edge. Small blocks, very pedestrian friendly, high connectivity and mixed land uses. On the right there, you can see an old urban pattern that was very much compromised by new suburban zoning style regulations, which blew out the size of the streets, got rid of a lot of the different street connections, brought in lots of surface parking, disrupted the connectivity. Really a very, very, very different environment. So Lydon again is looking at how do we get and support development patterns like that on the left and not like that on the right. So there's two images of what we've been doing, past and present. The corner store, which is the real corner store in my opinion, versus the corner store, which is really a gas station. Usually things now on the left are illegal, things on the right in zoning codes are allowed. So this is part of the issue with Lydon is it's really trying to get at the core DNA that gets created in our communities, which is through zoning. And again, thinking about street types, boulevard versus a boulevard. Historically, a boulevard was a very technical term for a specific street type, deployed over, in cities around Europe and also in America. But now we throw boulevard on any old wide arterial street. It really has no design meaning. It's just a giant roadway for happy motoring. So pattern design, 27 possible points. Again, the focus really here is on walkability. You can get up to 12 points. More than a fourth of your possible points in this, or actually almost half of your possible points are through the walkable streets. And what they're looking at is 4 key things, which is facades and entries. So are there consistent doorways? Is there glass on the storefronts? Entries to buildings, et cetera. Ground level uses, are there active retail frontages, office frontages, et cetera, that make you want to walk by a certain place along a block. Has a focus on design speed, not the posted speed, but the actual design speed, bringing speeds down as low as possible. A certain percentage of streets in Lydon have to be design speed, target design speed below 20 miles an hour or less, which says something. And then, of course, are there sidewalks? So there's up to 16 different items that you can achieve, and if you do so, you get 12 different points. If you go to an environment like on the right there, boulevard and corner store, you're not going to be able to achieve hardly any of those, I'm quite sure. So again, this is trying to encourage much more fine-grained development. And then the street network is again looking, this is just another point, 1 to 2 points, looking at the intersection density and the amount of connections you're making from your neighborhood that you're ostensibly developing under Lydon to its adjacent neighborhood or its context. And I won't go through all this. This is really just too much text for any slides, but you get the point. So what I'm here to ask you for today is to think about getting involved with Lydon and the LEED system in general. They've made some good improvements with the biking and the walking and connecting it to the bigger land use patterns, but there's still some involvement I think could be had, or I think APBP members could be involved and improve the actual things that are being measured. Now, some of my quick critiques were, throughout Lydon they reference different professional manuals and design guidelines. Under the bike parking and storage credit, they didn't reference the APBP manual, which I think would be a great thing for them to do. That's one. Again, they have no bicycle parking guidance for mixed-use buildings, which seems really kind of antithetical to what they're trying to do with Lydon itself. Let's see, one of the requirements for the bikeway network is that the bikeway network has to be at least 5 miles continuous and get you to 10 diverse uses within 3 miles. If you can't get to 10 places within 3 miles, I think that's a problem. So I think they're not really thinking about the efficiency of a bicycle and the distance you can cover and how things are, what they're trying to code in through Lydon is get things to be more compact. To blow things out to a 3-mile scale, in my opinion, is getting you much more at the suburban sprawl arterial scale. And then maybe a final thing is, as you're reading this, integrating the bike share into, they have a transportation demand credit, and they mention car sharing, but they're not mentioning bike sharing, which is becoming increasingly popular in cities across the U.S. So I think with that, I'll leave you with just, here's a couple of resources. The guide on the left, they have a guide for local governments. So the idea with Lydon is not to replace your zoning codes, but help to inform city policy and working with developers as you build out your designs. They have several good case studies of communities around the country who are looking to Lydon to help guide them in their review of projects that are being proposed within municipalities. And then if anyone knows Cade Benfield, who writes a great blog at Switchboard, which is through the NRDC, he helped work on a citizen's guide to LEED for neighborhood development. So trying to take all of the language, which is very complex, you're going to have to read this thing 5 times over to get a good sense of it. He tries to simplify it. So if you want the quick and dirty and effective overview, I would suggest reading the guide on the right for citizens. And finally, I'm sorry to do this, but I'm very excited about this project we're about to release next month, and I just wanted to share it with all of you and hopefully get you excited about it too. We've been working for the last year and a half on a research project on open streets, which are also called cyclovias. We've got 66 different case studies, and the website, which will be actually open source. If you in your community have your own initiatives, we'll be able to upload all of that to the website and update it and edit it as you have more and more over time. And there will be a print guide that goes along with that. So thank you for indulging me in that, but I just really want folks to visit that website when it comes out. It's a partnership with the Alliance for Biking and Walking. And so with that, I will take questions. Yeah.
Are there thresholds for like the area that you would use for analysis in terms of like half of a square mile or 3 square miles or something like that?
You mean being applied for projects?
Yeah.
Yeah. Lydon is actually being applied at the lot scale. I think the smallest project that was entered into the pilot phase in 2009 was maybe half an acre. Very, very small. So it's interesting that they're looking down to that scale, and then it goes all the way up to thousands of acres. So they're not looking for 100 to 300 acres. They're literally looking at anything that is mostly, it seems like, infill development. But I think at that point, they want it to be as flexible as possible for the developer to decide if they're going to go to lead ND, or then that's the emphasis they want to take, or is it going to be lead for new construction, or more the building, or they want to think about the neighborhood. I think in a lot of cases at the smaller scale, it's harder sometimes to demonstrate lead ND, and it's going to be easier to demonstrate just lead.
Is there anything for like municipalities or government? Like I guess if a community wanted to apply for lead ND solar status, they read their policy and ordinances. Would they be able to get that?
Not yet. It's really geared towards only new development, which obviously is intentionally trying to put it into existing places. But for already built out neighborhoods, you can't yet do that. Although LEED has seen that demand, and there's discussion in the works at the USGBC to do exactly that, is to have communities come and say, hey, we are LEED ND by what we've built because of our history, which I think would be a positive thing. Yeah. Right.
I live in a neighborhood built in the 20s and 30s that's nice and flat, has a great interconnected street network because they pushed all the high spots into the gullies when they built it. To what extent do you think disconnection in street networks is driven by the cost of bridging or avoiding streams and wetlands given current regulations, and how does LEED ND deal with that given the competing demands of street networks versus preserving those resources?
That's a really great question. I don't know the full technical answer because I'm not an expert on LEED ND. I'll just definitely come out and say that, but there are definitely, they address that issue with stormwater management, existing creeks, natural features in LEED ND, and they still want the network density to get those points still has to be as dense as possible. And if you think about, we use the example sometimes of Manhattan, which has 2,000 plus streams. If every stream was daylit tomorrow or was never built on in the first place, the discontinuity of the street network in Manhattan, you would really lose the benefit of that density and that dense network. So there has to be, give and take on that issue. If you're more urban, you probably want more connectivity in your network. If you're more residential or less urban, then you might look at solutions that have more of the daylighting, preservation, natural impact on the network. Yeah.
Mike, let me take a crack at answering that. I worked at the New Jersey Department of Transportation for 34 years. Later, I'm going to show some case studies of network projects that we try to do. And we, how shall I say, and we're going to call our Environmental Protection Agency the enemy, but we're often at loggerheads with them. Nonetheless, when we start getting the network design, this whole concept that the environmental movement is causing discontinuity in the network is really overblown. Yes, from time to time, if you have a sensitive wetlands or a stream crossing, you may miss a link or two. There's ways around it, particularly form partnership. So I wouldn't go there. I don't think it's fair at all to blame the environmental movement for, that story that Dwani tells about New York City is an interesting story, and to a certain extent there may be some truth to it, but in general, it's overblown to say that.
If you use paths instead of streets, does it still have that kind of connectivity, those roads for pedestrians and bicyclists?
Yeah, the street, the off-street path connections count as connections.
It's crazy. You can bridge those environmental barriers with paths, and it's a lot less onerous to the environmental people, and there's a way around
Right here.
To what degree do you think that the lead ND would be used by developers who are already developing in an area that meets these criteria and are like, oh, okay, this will be an easier way to get LEED certification, versus as a way to inspire other developers to consider building in places that fit the, fit these?
That's kind of on the city's end, I think, to try and push developers in that direction. If they want them to be redeveloping, they need other outside policies that are already directing them to those locations, I believe, and then hopefully developers might think about this. But developers who are already doing development in good places, a lot of them, I can't speak for some people who are doing development, but I think it's a costly and a very time-consuming process, and there's not enough people, I've heard, to review a lot of the actual applications, so it slows everything down. And that added cost right now, I think, is working against the better interests of the program, just because development and financing is a challenge. Back on the right.
I know the whole program is very new, or Lead ND is very new, but do you know if anyone studied who's moving into these communities? Because I hope I'm wrong, but my guess is that they tend to be less affordable, so people of color don't really get to benefit from these designs. Do you know if anyone's looking into that, or if that's the case?
There's people looking nationally at those trends through different programs, and through the lens of Lead ND. I don't have any resources like that.
Given the recent JAPA article by Reed Ewing and Robert Cervera that looked at how design in the built environment influences travel behavior, and they found that intersection density is right up at the top there with reducing VMT, and I think that's primarily due to trip length.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you think that street network should be given more points in Lead ND because of the seemingly large impact.
I think it doesn't have a larger impact on its own as a single credit because it shows up as a criteria in other credits throughout the system. I think I showed one of them where it's the and or, and when the and is part of it is and the or is part of it, if you're going to choose, they have the connectivity issue of trying to get more than 200, 300, 400 intersections per square mile.
And I think the other issue is with allowing multi-use paths, that great for a number of reasons to qualify for that network connectivity is for those people that do still choose to drive, they're still taking circuitous routes and driving along. So.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, wondering about transit access. A lot of subdivisions are on one side of a busy suburban road. Transit is on that busy suburban road, and you can't cross the street safely. Mm-hmm. Is there anything in Lead ND that addresses that, gives criteria for what's a safe crossing to get to a transit stop, for instance?
I would have to read it more closely and would encourage others to do that. That's a big issue. One of the critiques from someone named Lawrence Arbach, who's been kind of nose on this issue from the very beginning with Lead ND and its development. One of his critiques is that too many arterial streets are allowed to persist in neighborhood development still underneath Lead ND. So that's one of the
there aren't any negative points for barriers.
But they can still be there, and that obviously has detrimental effects for transit, for walking, for everything else. So I think they have a percentage of what has to be at that certain design speed, and that's encouraging to see, but it's probably not the number or the percentage of streets that we'd all like to see. So I think pushing on that would be a valuable thing.